shift gears to talk about the role of non-state actors in Latin America. I will talk more in depth about the case of Brazil and specifically Rio de Janeiro, because this is still a very situation that is still in flux. And most of the evidence I've looked at in recent weeks has been from Rio de Janeiro, but it illustrates the challenges that Latin America faces with the what I think is a weakened and a more problematic, less capable state and government capacity to respond to the socio-economic challenges in view of a very strong and consolidated illicit and predatory forces of non-state armed groups in Latin America. So in March, many international media outlets picked up on the story of Brazilian criminal groups, especially drug trafficking factions in Rio de Janeiro, imposing social distancing measures in the territorial bases in favelas. And this is accurate, this is real. The criminal groups used simple local outlets like pamphlets and local community radio stations to announce curfews and threaten punishment if such measures were not taken seriously. And similar social assistance measures, if we can call it that, have been reported in Mexico by drug cartels and elsewhere as well, for instance, in South Africa, in the case of Cape Town. However, some of these initial reports may have created what I think is an overly simplistic impression of organized crime as stepping up to fill a governance vacuum by the state in marginalized urban areas. This may be the case sometimes and in some areas, but as the weeks went by, the picture has become a bit more complicated. Again, to briefly take us outside of Latin America, in South Africa, for instance, the distribution of food supplies to vulnerable families by gangs placed recipient families in difficult situations because sometimes the gangs with the social assistance also requested or pressured families for aiding them in distributing drugs during the pandemic. Similarly, in Brazil, the drug gangs have indeed stepped up to a limited degree in making up for the lack of decisive political action by local and federal governments and leaders in implementing social distancing. But at the same time, they contributed and they contribute obstacles to local communities in accessing public services through violence, recruitment of young men to crime, and threats to civil society. So these basic public services offered by non-state armed groups in slums are well known by local communities in Latin America. They do not, however, make criminal groups necessarily more popular than the state. Rather, both state and non-state actors compete in a sort of perverse game of multi-layered governance, which is the fragmentation of public service provision and rules by different local lords, local sources of authority, creating situations of permanent insecurity and instability for locals. And I think that trend tends to become even more intense in coming months and years. A painfully clear example of this multi-layered governance came in early April, when the health minister in Brazil, Luiz Henrique Mandetta, then health minister, in contradiction of his own boss, President Jair Bolsonaro's anti-quarantine stance, said that his team was talking to drug traffickers and militias in order to respond to the pandemic, since, quote, many times the state is absent and drug traffickers and militias rule, end quote. So his comment was very controversial, but they laid bare the real social and political impact of non-state armed governance in Brazilian favelas, the decline of state legitimacy and the consolidation of an alternative and predatory order by criminal and militia groups. Sometimes this alternative order will result in somewhat positive measures for locals, such as the stepping up of criminal gangs in Rio for imposing curfews and banning the opening of businesses and circulation of cars during certain hours. Another measure, for instance, that armed groups have taken to contribute to social distancing is the imposition and to the anti-pandemic sort of measures was the imposition of a price cap on sanitizing gel and cooking gas in view of rising demand and lower incomes. And yet another measure was some drug gangs prohibiting tourists from entering some of their gang-controlled favelas, since at the beginning of the virus was transmitted primarily by foreigners and people who had traveled abroad. However, the case of Rio also illustrates what I think is the most fundamental impact of organized crime and non-state groups during the pandemic: their resilience and ability to retain both illicit economic revenue and armed power through the pandemic, which I think at the end, when we come out of this, will be quite important to have in mind, since we will be facing a situation in which a weakened and less well-resourced state will hopefully have to contend with this still quite strong and powerful non-state actors. So to give you a few examples, a report by local O Globo newspaper has revealed in Rio that armed clashes involving either drug traffickers and militias have been going on in 20 areas of the metropolitan area of Rio. And these have included full-on gang wars for the control of some spaces during the quarantine or the social distancing period. One such territorial struggle in the slums of Dezoito and Sassu in Rio, in the western area of Rio, involved 2 drug gangs and 1 militia group at the same time, so 3 armed groups, showing that the ambition to control territory and establish predatory order has become widespread among groups of different orientations. Furthermore, these clashes were mostly concentrated in northern and western areas of Rio de Janeiro metropolitan area, and these are the same areas that have been hit hard by the coronavirus. And this is probably not a causal relationship. The presence of armed groups probably has not caused the worsening of the pandemic in such areas, but the fact that these areas have been consistently underserviced by the state and predated upon by armed groups have probably contributed to the lack of institutional capacity and health systems in these areas. Another clear example from Rio is the role of the so-called militias, which are armed groups formed by former or off-duty police officers or military personnel, originally as vigilantes to provide security in exchange for taxes that they extract from these low-income areas. The militia groups have a law and order discourse that is, by the way, similar in some ways to the one being voiced by Bolsonaro at the federal level, of providing order by the barrel of the gun and killing criminal suspects sometimes without trial. One of the main differences between militias and drug traffickers in Rio is the political economy of their movements. Militias mostly oppose to dealing in drugs and instead rely on extortion of local businesses, the so-called protection tax, and the provision of illicit services such as cooking gas, minibuses for public transportation, internet access, etc. So reports have been emerging in recent weeks of how militias have been forcing businesses in low-income areas to stay open in order to retain that extortion income. Their local power is so pervasive that they can interfere in the public hospitals, for instance, to speed up appointments or offer better equipment for those that contributed to the militias. They can also interfere in the company that offers burials. So in the city of Duque de Caxias, there's only one company that offers burials for the city. And this service has faced severe pressure recently in order to speed up or offer better prices for burials. The militias have interfered and helped those that are in the good books of the militias or pay them on the side. And by the way, the militias are stronger in the western and northern areas of Rio, which again are the same ones that have been hotspots for the COVID-19 in recent weeks. So this forcing of businesses to stay open for extortion purposes and interference in other areas of governance have perhaps, it's quite, I think, likely that it has contributed to the higher number of cases in those areas. And I don't want to make it seem like this is restricted to Rio. This is, I'm using several examples from Rio because it's where I've seen a lot of evidence erupting. But when we go outside of the city of Rio, we have also seen the lingering local power of criminal groups. In the northeastern city of Fortaleza, for instance, two gangs, the Red Command and the Guardians of the State, have been fighting for territory. And once again, we see in Fortaleza the criminal clashes coinciding with the area most affected by the pandemic in terms of incidents and deaths, an area known as Regional 1. This therefore points to the resilience of organized crime and armed groups, as well as the resilience of their local illicit economies in face of a weakened state. As I think will become clear in this discussion, informal workers, which comprise the bulk of the economy in many low-income neighborhoods in Brazil, are some of the most vulnerable to the economic impacts of the pandemic and lockdown measures. States will emerge of the pandemic with weaker fiscal outlooks and perhaps even more concerning, in some cases, politically weakened, with even more political polarization, reduced trust among many sectors of society on national leaders, and a tarnished relationship between national, regional, and local governments, which have adopted different interpretations of the responses to COVID and are emerging of the crisis with the relationships pretty damaged. So these rifts place state governments at much weaker position to respond to the profound governance and security crisis underlining non-state armed groups in cities. So in a way, in summary, the main, I think, impact of these non-state groups coming from the still quite early evidence that we are seeing is actually how they have not changed, and they have been able to retain their illicit economies and their local power. And I think we are going to see the greatest impact, the greatest change in the weeks and months to come, because as I said, the the state governments will, in contrast, emerge of this crisis with a weaker, weaker political and economic position, and the balance of power, I think, has begun to change, and in a way that worryingly favors organized crime.